Well, good evening, friends. As you come into our webinar tonight, my name is Chris Streeter, and I have the pleasure of serving here in the Diocese of Central Pennsylvania as the Canon for Mission Development and Innovation. And on behalf of our Bishop, Audrey Scanlon, and the rest of the diocesan staff and our Shaped by Faith leadership team, I welcome you tonight to the second of our 5-part webinar series celebrating our stories. As many of you know, for the last almost 2 years now, our diocese has been embarking on an initiative that we call Shaped by Faith, an invitation for each parish in the diocese to discern areas of strength and vitality, to root ourselves in our sense of identity, of core value, of missional focus, and ask ourselves how God may be inviting us to reshape ourselves as an institution, to enter into new intentional partnerships and collaborations. And a major part of this work of acknowledging where we are in the present, of imagining where God is calling us to be in the future, is also doing that work of holding the mirror up to ourselves and recognizing the history and the stories that have shaped our faith communities. And so I'm thrilled to be joined again tonight by our friend Carolyn Patterson. How are you, Carolyn?
I'm well, thank you. It's good to be here again and looking forward to a good presentation.
So glad that you're here, Carolyn, and especially grateful for Carolyn's work in inviting our featured speaker tonight, who is a good friend of Carolyn. So Carolyn, will you tell us who we are blessed to have joining us tonight?
Okay, thank you, Chris. Yes, I'm very happy to introduce to you my old friend, Amy Skillman. Amy currently works as the academic director of the MA program in cultural sustainability at Goucher College in Maryland. And she's also working as a folklorist for the Susquehanna Folk Music Society. And she said she'd let us know a little bit more about what that entails. I've known Amy for near on 20 years. And I met her through a oral history story circle, story gathering experience that I had with a group of women who were immigrants and refugees to this country. And Amy gathered up our group of very different women, got us comfortable enough to tell our story, and helped us to build a community, and took us to a point where we were comfortable putting on plays and mounting an exhibit at the State Museum, all the time preserving our valuable history and stories. And so I knew she was the right person for this webinar. So without further ado, I give you Amy Skillman.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. It's so great to be here with you. I really appreciate this opportunity and the invitation to participate. I am going to share my screen. And, oops, are you able to see that?
It looks great, Amy. Thank you.
Oh, good. Okay.
Oh,
oops, I just hit, yeah, it went away. Let me try that again. Share screen. There you go. Can you see that?
Perfect.
Okay, great. So again, thank you so much. I am here to talk a little bit with you about creating an oral history collection for your church or your parish. I understand that last week, those of you that may have attended this is one of several sessions coming up over the month of May, beginning in late April. Looking at, as Chris said, how do we collect and share and tell the stories of our community of faith, our community geographically, our church community. As Carolyn said, I am trained as a folklorist. I spent much of my career working with communities to document their valued traditions and to help them find ways to preserve, sustain, and to share what is meaningful about their stories and their culture. And in particular, as Carolyn said, I worked with Carolyn and the Pennsylvania Immigrant and Refugee Women's Network to gather oral history interviews with refugee and immigrant women. And I think that the thing that's important here is that it was an opportunity to gather stories in order to create end products, other kinds of end products that shared the experiences and the values and the the courage and the amazing stories of those women. We created an exhibition, we created a cookbook that is filled with stories, and we did 2 theater pieces. I also designed an oral history project for the LGBT Center in Harrisburg, and I think it was at the 50th anniversary of Stonewall, when they wanted to make sure that they were gathering the stories of people in central Pennsylvania who who knew about or may have been part of that movement. I have also worked as a trainer, an oral history trainer for the American Folklore Society and the Oral History Association, mostly drawing on my experiences in some of the projects I just told you about to give people tips and strategies for doing good interviews. And then, as Carolyn said, I've been working for the last 10 years designing the curriculum for this MA program in cultural sustainability. And it's a way to train the next generation of cultural advocates. And our curriculum includes courses in oral history, community documentation, policy, partnerships, and that sort of thing. So I'm very excited to be here. I grew up in an Episcopal church, so it's really fun for me to be part of helping you think about how you might do an oral history collection in your own church or parish or community. So this is my agenda. What is oral history? Why do an oral history project? And then I'm going to share some tips and strategies for creating your own oral history collection. If you do have questions, feel free to post them in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen, and either Chris or Carolyn will, please feel free to interrupt me to ask a question. I did try to build in time for questions at the end so that we can maybe have a little bit more of a conversation. So what is oral history? Oral history is both an artifact, so the recorded interview that might be added to an archive, but it's also a research methodology. It's a qualitative process for gathering life stories with a goal of maybe better understanding a particular phenomenon. As a qualitative methodology, it's actually a field of study, and one can pursue an MA degree in oral history at places like Columbia University. There's a fabulous public oral history program there. And the University of Maryland has, Baltimore County also has a really great oral history master's program. So Linda Shopes, who is, some of you may even know her. She is from central Pennsylvania. I think she lives in Boiling Springs. She's, however, nationally known oral historian, and I have worked with her extensively over the last 30 some years. But she says that oral history is, first of all, it's an interview, which is an exchange or a dialogue between two people. So it's not strictly simply recorded speech, but that dialogue, that exchange is actually part of the interesting aspect of oral history. It is something that's intended to be for the record. That is, that we record these things, we put them into archives so that that other people in the future have access, and that they are preserving the stories and being made available to others. It's historical in intent, and by that I mean that it's driven by questions that have an historical dimension. So it's a conversation in the now, but it's usually about the then and what all of that implies about our understanding about the now, right? It is inherently subjective or intersubjective, and I think this is really important because people think that that interviews are objective, that you leave all of your knowledge, your experience, your cultural, your biases, your cultural baggage, if you will, that you leave at the door. And that's pretty hard to do. And it's actually an interview that is grounded in, it's an artifact that's grounded in memory and in language, which are two frames of reference that try to seek a common understanding of in some way. It's an inquiry in depth, so it's not casual or spontaneous conversation, but it's really planned out, and it's oral, or in the case of deaf narrators, it might be visual, but grounded in voice and grounded in gesture. And it's not just an interview, it's actually a context with outcomes. The context and that outcomes are very much a part of that interview process. So, so the next question is, why do an oral history? You know, oral history collections are done for lots of reasons. They might be done to commemorate a particular event, to reflect back on an organization's history, perhaps as part of an anniversary celebration, to amplify the voices of marginalized communities, to understand a particular moment in time through multiple voices and multiple experiences. Oral history interviews actually help us see connections between individual personal experiences and these broader historical patterns, such as maybe social change within the Episcopal Diocese. Of course, we're interested in and even gripped by the singular biographical narrative. And I've had some amazing interviews with people where the narrative is just gripping and incredibly powerful all on its own. You know, what happened, what a person thinks happened, and what they make of it. But an oral history also invites interpretation of those narratives in order to connect to something or some things that are bigger, something outside of the individual or the personal, perhaps to understand kind of intersecting histories that surround that individual. So, for instance, as I've said, I'm really interested in the power of story to educate and to transform lives, to better understand how we interact at the crossroads, in particular of culture and tension. I've done some work with the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress, gathering amazing stories from veterans of multiple wars, everywhere from, I've interviewed people that were in World War II all the way up to the Afghan War. And these have been turned into exhibits. They've been turned into books, not just my interview, but a whole range of interviews turned into exhibits and books and publicly accessible archives that that have an interpretation, or that, you know, sort of allow us to go up to 10,000 feet and look down and say, this is actually really the larger context for what's happening here. In the stories that I've done with refugee and immigrant women, again, each of those interviews was really, really powerful in and of itself, but taken as a large body of knowledge and viewed from that 10,000 foot level, that collection reveals really profound truths about courage and about motherhood and about diversity and about the work that we still have to do to be a welcoming nation. Oral historian Alexander Fryn notes that we have fallen under the spell of storytelling. Storytelling, especially in the form of public talk about oneself, has become a kind of new social phenomenon, and I think it's probably fueled by the popular radio series StoryCorps. These kinds of stories seem to kind of privilege narratives about competitive individualism. They're often confessional stories that become, you know, once they're retold and edited by the team at StoryCorps, they become these kind of tearjerkers that assume a particular, maybe a commonality that may or may not actually be there. And Alexander Fryn kind of cautions us against conflating these kinds of stories with oral history. where oral history is really everybody has a story to tell, and it's about everything from the mundane to the powerful. And these sort of commoditized stories really deny, I think, a diversity of experiences and multiple voices and responses and reactions that really shape our realities. So yet in telling our stories, we have kind of stumbled upon one of the most powerful medicines that we have. According to psychologist Lisa Rankin, every time you tell your story, I find this fascinating, to someone else who cares and bears witness to it, you turn off the body's stress responses. You actually flip off toxic stress hormones like cortisol and epinephrine, and you flip on relaxation responses that release healing hormones like oxytocin, dopamine, nitric oxide, and endorphins. So not only does this turn on the body's innate self-repair mechanisms and function as preventative medicine or treatment if you're sick, it also relaxes your nervous system and helps heal your mind of depression, anxiety, fear, anger, and feelings of disconnection. So in some ways, I think this is really the gift of doing oral history, is this opportunity to heal. But there are lots of other reasons to gather oral narratives to complement an archive. So archives often have written documents or print records or artifacts, and these alone kind of limit our understanding of history to those who have been able to write about it or to those whose stories have been passed on and told. And this often privileges people who have the time and the income to be able to take the time to write the record, to pass down those stories, and to and the space to share and to preserve those stories. So reliance on the written word is based on a dominant cultural value, writing, and you might read white and Western here, rather than another really important shared value by all families, all communities, and all peoples, which is that oral or visual way of telling a story. So oral histories literally have a voice of their own, which can guide our community storytelling. When someone shares their story through oral tradition, we actually hear their interpretation of their life in their own words and their own voice. Public historian Michael Frisch talks about the collection of oral history interviews as shared authority, the idea that we collect stories in negotiation with those willing to share them. And I think this is a really important piece too. Oral history interviews, through oral history interviews, we learn what community members want to share with us. And perhaps the most important part of telling a larger story is first listening carefully to what others who have lived that experience have to say. Oral histories can anchor us in community voices rather than in our own personal narrative. They remind us that multiple perspectives can inform an event. And, you know, we all have examples from our own lives. I can think of the time that my brother and I, at the age of 4 and 5, decided to play barbershop with my mom's dog's electric shears. And you can imagine where that story goes. But my brother and I have really different interpretations of that story. You know, for me, it was in the summer. For him, it was in the winter. For me, it was Mrs. Peach who found us. For him, it was Mrs. Pear who found us. I mean, it's so interesting just that within the same experience that we have different interpretations of it. And I think this is part of what is exciting about collecting a range of oral histories and understanding how those stories as a whole, you know, tell us about our community. So I wanted to share with you some excellent resources that we can put these links. No, we can't put these links in the chat. I forgot, we're in a different format. But you will have access to this PowerPoint, so you'll be able to access this. But the Oral History Association is a national organization that has a page on best practices in doing oral history projects. The Smithsonian Institution has, how to do an oral history. And I wanted to take just a minute to share with you, okay, let's see, where did I put that document?
As you're pulling that up, Amy, I'll just remind folks, feel free to go ahead as I know for me, your presentation is already stirring up some really good questions in my brain.
Oh, good.
So
okay.
Feel free, friends, to put any of those questions in the Q&A, and as time permits, we'll get to them. But Amy, yeah, what video do you have for us?
Great. So this is just a short little video that I wanted to share with you from the Smithsonian. It's only 2 minutes. So
Hi,
let's
everyone.
play that. Are you able to hear
I'm
it?
a historian here at the Smithsonian Institution Archives, and we're going to run through a few steps so you can start doing oral histories at home. What's oral history? It's a method of interviewing we use to preserve the voices, memories, and perspectives of people in history. It's a tool we can all use to engage with and learn from family members, friends, and the people we share space with in an interview that captures their unique history and perspective in their own words. To start conducting oral histories at home, let's run through 5 easy steps. Step 1, ask someone if they'd like to participate. Living with a grandparent right now, want to learn more about your siblings? See if they'd like to be interviewed, get their permission, and you're good to go. Step 2, prepare for the interview. Prepare an introduction where you state your name, your interviewee's name, the date, and the location. This way, anyone listening to the interview tomorrow or 50 years from now knows what they're listening to. And remember to always ask them if you have permission to record at the start of the interview. Then for questions, I always like to start an interview with, tell me about where you're from. Then you can prepare questions and topics based on what you already know, and then ask them maybe to talk about other moments in history they've lived through. We've also posted some sample questions for you. Step 3, remember to be an active listener. This means listen carefully and don't immediately jump to your next question. Remember to ask follow-up questions and don't be afraid to say, tell me more about that. Step 4, recording the interview. Smartphones today have built-in recording software. For me, it's the voice memo app on my phone that will let me record an MP3 audio file. So what you'll do is you'll pull up the app, set the phone equally distant between you and your interviewee so it picks up on both of your voices. Then you hit record, you say your introduction, and you get started with your interview. Step 5, when you're done, thank your interviewee, stop the recording, send the recording to your email, maybe save it to the cloud, and then send it to friends and family. And now you have a piece of history that you can listen to and learn from. And with these steps, you have the basics to start recording oral histories at home. Learn more about recording oral histories at the Smithsonian here. Hi everyone, I'm Hannah Byrne. I'm a historian.
Great. So I love that she put hit record in bigger, bolder letters because I have done that where I have done an interview and the record button was flashing, and at the end of the interview I realized that I never actually hit record, that I just did a whole interview with no recording. So anyway, so I think what I love about that interview is in 2 minutes she was able to kind of succinctly share with you sort of how simple it is to just get started and start doing interviews. I wanted to share, I think Carolyn and Chris had asked me to talk a little bit about how do you get started as in your own parish or in your own church.
And remember to always ask them if you have permission to
you
record at the start of the interview.
Now,
Then for
Amy,
questions,
you need to just
I always
stop
like
the
to
video.
start an interview
We're
with,
hearing the video again.
oh, you are, did it start up again? Shoot.
There you go.
Okay.
We're all set, dear.
Okay, good. I just edited that. Okay, so now do you see the tips and guidelines for creating your own oral history collection? Okay,
Yep.
Wonderful. So, so basically, I think, you know, as an organization, church or parish or whatever, you know, starting with making the commitment to do it. Can you gather a group of people together and have conversations? about making this commitment? Can you seek out, can you set aside some funding or seek some funding, maybe get some grant money to cover things like training and supplies? And I think knowing why you want to do this, I think this small group of people to sit down and say, okay, what do we want to focus on? Do we want to interview everybody in our parish that's over 70? So we make sure we get all their stories. Or are we interested in the altar guild and, you know, the stories about the altar guild? Are we interested in how the liturgy has changed over time? Or do we want to interview people about, you know, particular moments in time in our church, so that we have those as records? I remember in my church, the year that we switched to a folk music type of music, and that, you know, how interesting how the reactions among all the congregants to that. So, you know, those kinds of moments in time. So knowing kind of why you want to do this and setting up that process. I think it's really important to get community input. So maybe have gatherings like this, you know, where you talk about this idea and you get people excited. It creates ownership. It gets people around a table to talk about what is it that's most interesting to you and where do you want to focus your oral history collection if you do. I think the next step is finding people both to interview and to be interviewed. You know, your parish might put out a call for people to be interviewed, and that's a really good place to start, but you want to make sure that you plan to reach out to people who may not feel comfortable automatically responding to a call like that. They might not think they have a story to tell. So how can you use an oral history process to make sure that you're reaching the really quiet people, or the people that you know don't think they have much to say or have a story to tell, and make sure that you're looking at gender diversity, and you're looking at ethnic diversity, and you're looking at income diversity, and all of those things. Start with who you know, and kind of work out from there and build a cadre. So the other side of this is finding people to do interviews. Again, people might feel that they're happy to be interviewed, but they don't feel comfortable doing the interview. This is where training can really be important, to do a workshop with people to help them get comfortable and help them learn about how to handle an interview and how to do it in a way that can be effective. So then creating your interview protocol, this is the set of questions that you want to ask. And I think one of the hardest parts about doing an interview, but also probably one of the most interesting, is thinking about questions that get at kinds of contextual issues you're interested in exploring. So, you know, if you want to know about larger social contexts, you're not going to say, tell me about larger social contexts. You might say, tell me about what life was like then. Tell me, you know, who did you play with? You know, what were the who did you not play with and why? Those kinds of things. So you develop this set of questions. And the nice thing, if you're doing like an oral history collection in your parish or in your church, if everybody is working from the same set of questions, continuity across the kinds of interviews that every interview is going to be different. But this interview protocol acts as a guideline to make sure that you're asking the same question of everybody, especially if you're interested in a particular topic. So you just want to make sure that the Library of Congress website, the Veterans History Project at the Library of Congress has a really great field kit for designing questions, for coming up with interview protocols. Now, their questions are obviously focused on people who served in various wars, because they're trying to collect those stories, but it's a nice guide for thinking about how you might want to design your protocol. These interviews follow a logical progression from simple, easy to answer questions all the way up to maybe harder questions, or questions that might elicit more emotional reactions or responses. You don't want to begin with those harder questions. You want to begin with easier ones that helps build rapport, helps create a relationship, gets people comfortable with each other, and that sort of thing. You also, if you're the interviewer or even as the committee, you want to do some background research. What do you already know? What do you think people in your community already know? And what question, where are the gaps? What do you not know? What are the voices that aren't there? And you know, what are the moments in time where there's no information? And maybe find those gaps. Or what do you already know about certain moments in time? And how can an oral interview augment what's already in your collection that's written? So, you know, and then choosing your equipment. Today is so interesting. You know, when I first started out, I did some interviews for the Library of Congress where I had this great big Nagra reel-to-reel tape recorder and microphones on a boom stand with the wind guards and all of that. Even when I did interviews with Carolyn and the group at the Pennsylvania Immigrant and Refugee Women's Network, we had a Marantz tape recorder and we had microphones and all of that. But now you can use your phone. And the most recent interviews I've been doing with the Susquehanna Folk Music Society with traditional artists in central Pennsylvania, if you know of any, let me know. We've been doing Zoom interviews. We've been using Zoom. An external mic on my end. Sometimes they might have an external mic, but just to get higher quality. But using the technology now, it's so much easier. And then you've got a file that's already done and you just upload it when you're ready. You upload it into, a cloud archive where everything is gathered. You want to think about how do you get a good quality interview. If you're doing video, you want good lighting. I often will sit for a minute and just listen to the space. It's really hard to do that because you want to fill that space, but I'll listen. Is there a ticking clock? Is the TV on downstairs? Are there lots of kids outside, and try to find a space that's not really busy, that's not really noisy. If you're doing video, try to find space that's well lighted, not fluorescent lighting. That stuff is noisy and it makes us all look gray and purple. Whereas if you use incandescent lighting, we have golder colors or, richer colors. And I think for the most important thing when you're using your equipment is make sure you practice with it ahead of time as much as you possibly can. And so that you're really comfortable with it. I usually, when I start an interview, I always start, as Hannah said, with my name's Amy Skillman. I'm doing an interview with Carolyn Patterson for the Pennsylvania Immigrant and Refugee Women's Network. Today is May 5th. And Carolyn, do you give me permission to interview you? And I try to get that on the tape so that everybody knows that we've not only to interview you, but do you give me permission to record this interview? Which gets me to this last point here about logs and release forms. It's really important to develop a release form, and you can find lots of examples of this. This link right here takes you to a release form that's used by the Library of Congress. It's really easy to modify that. But the release form, the purpose of the release form is to make sure that everybody agrees that you are going to record this interview, that you give permission for your interview to become part of a collection, and you give the church or the parish or the Library of Congress or the Smithsonian or whomever the permission to use that interview in maybe follow-up educational materials. What it does is it protects you, the person being interviewed, from them using your interview for commercial purposes. And that's usually stated very clearly in that release form. The logs are really important. If you can hire somebody to transcribe all the interviews. I was fortunate enough to have a grant, and I actually hired Carolyn, who did a fabulous job transcribing all of our interviews. And it was really great because then she and I were the two people in the program that had that 10,000-foot perspective about what everybody said, how everybody responded, what were the key themes or ideas that came up. And so, you know, create a log or a transcript so that future researchers can go in and look at that material. And that if they're doing research on altar guilds, for instance, they could do a search among your logs for any interviews where they talked about altar guilds, where that keyword comes up. And then they'll have immediate access to an awful lot of really fabulous content. The last thing I will say is never, never, ever, ever interview anyone without their permission. Journalists do this all the time. Spies do it all the time. It's a very unethical thing to do in our field. So we always want to make sure that people feel comfortable being interviewed. I will share that interview or the release form with them. I'll share it with them at the beginning and tell them about it. But at the end, I won't invite them to sign it until the end. And the reason for that is that they might say, you know, that story in the middle that I told you about my father, I really don't want that on the public record. So we may have gone in and deleted it or stopped the recording at that moment. And there's all kinds of other things we could talk about how to actually do a recording and how, you know, what are the things to think about while you're in the middle of it. And maybe we'll leave that for questions. And I've had instances where where people have said, can we stop the recording? I've also had experiences where people have become very emotional and I didn't stop the recording. It was one of the hardest things I've ever had to do was to not stop the recording when I just wanted to stop the recording and hug this person and become their friend. But they didn't ask to stop the recording. And in the end, I think in that format was cathartic for that person. It was an opportunity for her to tell a very difficult story publicly for the first time and paved the way for her to begin to actually talk about that in the future. So, you know, one thing I would suggest is that there are lots of really good tips and strategies for doing the actual interviews, and we can talk about those in the Q&A. We've got some time left. The very last thing is follow up. I would say make sure that you send a thank you note to the person that you've interviewed, and that you do your logs and that you do it sooner rather than later, because the longer you wait, the harder it is to go back to an interview and do those logs or do those transcripts. So let's see. Yeah, so I did have some tips here for successful interviews. I usually keep them to 30 to 90 minutes. I never do more than 2 interviews in a day. It's exhausting. You can get yourself really exhausted. I think some of this I've already said. Yeah, practice with each other. Oh, it's interesting to work in teams where one person is doing the interviewing and another person might be running the equipment. That takes that responsibility away from you from doing both of those. Also, as I said at the very beginning, think about the things that might impact your own rapport or your own perception. One thing that's really important is the way you design your questions to avoid yes/no questions, because you're trying to get stories, and to avoid leading questions like, you know, I really didn't like it when the church moved from traditional hymns to folk music. What did you think? That's a very leading question, right? They feel like, oh, I wonder if I need to say I didn't like it, you know? So you want to design your questions so that you're not leading people to an answer that you anticipate. And I think some of this we've already talked about too. Chat with the interviewee while you're setting up. That kind of helps to break the ice and get people comfortable, get you comfortable, get them comfortable. This is important. Be mindful of future listeners. I try really hard to avoid saying and saying and interjecting. It's important that my question is heard, but it's not important that my ahas and my ums are heard, because then it becomes harder to use that as a discrete, maybe recording for a podcast or something. I lean in, I use nods a lot. I use my body language to encourage people along. It's okay to go off script when you're following a protocol, but you want to reel people back in so that you keep on track and you keep moving forward with the points of your interview. Photographs and objects can also be really good at helping people, getting people talking. So I think those are some of my tips, and here's more tips. I think I want to take a break though and ask questions instead of going through this. And so let me just end with, each story is a gift, treasure it and learn from it. So thank you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Amy. I'm going to put it on gallery view so people can see the three of us. Thank you for this. A couple questions if we can. And again, I'll just remind the folks that are with us live, feel free to put things in the Q&A if you like. But one of the questions in the Q&A, Amy, is one that I was reflecting on earlier in your presentation. You mentioned, I was really struck by you talking about how sharing our stories, you said it can kind of lower our body's stress responses and kind of turn on those healing responses. I'm struck by that, and I recognize that sometimes when we are sharing our stories, particularly maybe some of the more shameful parts of our community's history, you know, there is this kind of raised anxiety, right? So I wonder if you have any tips. The way that our bishop posed a question in the chat was wondering if you have any advice for how to process some of the more shameful stories we might be holding in our history, especially those around racist behaviors in our church's past. So I wonder, if there is a dichotomy there between, sharing those stories in a way that really kind of raises the level of anxiety, and then are there tips and strategies for sharing stories in a way that can really promote the kind of healing that I think we want, to come from an experience like this? So anything you can share?
I think the example I gave of the person who shared with me a shameful experience in her life and a really hard experience in her life is a good example where for the moment it triggered her tears, it triggered embarrassment, but I think my compassion about it, my willingness to listen, I leaned in, actually. I didn't lean away. I think our body language is so important. So leaning in is amazing unconscious message that I care and that I'm listening and that I want to hear. And I think that reaction enabled her to continue to tell her story, to continue to talk, and that ultimately there was a release for her afterwards that she had told it. So I think that's one thing, but I also think that, and the other thing I didn't talk about, which we have done, especially with the refugee and immigrant women, is story circles, where we have a topic and people come together in a circle, and you set some ground rules for the circle. So nobody is wrong in this, no story is incorrect. Everybody gets a chance to speak. Everybody gets a chance to speak without anybody responding. In other words, don't jump in and say, but my story is, jump in. What happens is people will jump in and tell their story, and then it diminishes the value of the story just told. Rather, listen, take a deep breath and listen. If you do that around challenging topics, what happens is one story begets another, and people begin to share more stories. And as somebody becomes bold and courageous and tells an experience that they're not proud of, other people may be willing to tell their experiences that they're not proud of. I think an important thing in that scenario is to eventually move that conversation toward what can we do? What can we do with this knowledge now? You know, that something in the past that we're not proud of. How do we feel about that now? And I think especially, I mean, this is really a challenging question, tough question, right? Just racist behaviors. And so many people don't even acknowledge systemic racism and the ways in which they are unconsciously being racist. So it's such a tricky, sensitive thing to use these stories to kind of give examples and pull people out in a way that feels safe, that encourages bravery. You know, I mean, a lot of people talk about safe spaces. I like to think of them as brave spaces, as places to be brave and really say something that you're afraid to say, and know that because we've set some ground rules at the beginning, that we all will honor whatever you say, and it stays here, and that at the end we all think about, okay, well, what's our next step? What can we do now? You know, I think, yeah. So I don't know if that helps. I think it's a critical question. And I think just asking it opens the door to strategies. I think being compassionate, being honest, being sincere, being real, taking the time, letting people collect their thoughts. There's also that kind of, when hard conversations are happening, people, you might think someone's shutting down when in fact what they're doing is thinking and collecting their thoughts. So allowing the time for people to collect their thoughts and to add, you know, and to think about it and then to pass or to participate.
That's really helpful, Amy. And so can I just to clarify, so am I hearing you say, I feel like I heard most of the example that you gave, and the technique was around kind of dialogue, interview style, but am I hearing you say that there are times when you might suggest kind of having a larger group engage in sharing around I mean, would you then kind of specify this is the topic that we're gonna explore? Can you say a little bit? I'm curious about that, kind of the larger group sharing.
What we would do, I mean, what I've done and what I teach my students to do if they want to use group interview or story circle to address a particular topic is, you know, people know in advance what the topic is, so they're not coming in blind or blindsided, and they're not feeling squirmy and how can I get out of this because this is what I was expecting. So they might come knowing what the topic is. You know, you might even share questions in advance so people can take the time to think about what has been my experience. I can remember one where we asked people to think about a time early in their lives when they realized there was difference. You know, whether they were Black or white or Mexican or Cambodian or whatever. Do they remember a time in their life when they realized that they were different or that there was difference? And to think about that, and then to think about how that felt. And that's one way to kind of start talking about difference, and to start talking about how maybe racism showed up in their childhood with them not, and they don't have to own it because they can recognize that, gosh, this happened when I was 8. Of course it wasn't my fault. Of course, it was this larger systemic issue that's happening. And so then it becomes this way to sort of everybody share that story, and then maybe bring that up into the to current time and ask another question about, you know, a contemporary experience when you saw something, again, focusing on racism, where you saw something racist and you didn't respond. And how did that feel? and what would you do now, or what would you go back and do if you could? What did you need to know in order to be able to respond? So, you know, those might be some ways of having very intentional, so now that feels to me less about, that feels to me using story as a way to heal, as a way to recognize a challenge, and a way to begin to try to find solutions in a group that really wants to work toward that. And, you know, gathering. So,
Amy,
that's
a
helpful.
follow-up practical question to that. If you're doing a group interview or a story circle, how do you handle the permissions like you would on a one-on-one? You have your, do you still need to have everyone in the group sign the release form? Do you do it at the beginning, or do you do the same like you would in the personal interview, beginning and end? What is the best way to deal with that in a group situation?
If you are recording now, some of the scenarios I just described may not be recorded. They may be a story circle within a community, the goal being to use our memory and our stories as a way to address a particular theme or issue. If you are, however, but if you are recording that group interview, definitely you would need to get everybody to sign off on it. And again, I would do the same thing at the end. The problem there, the challenge there, I shouldn't say it's a problem, but the challenge there is if one person decides that they are really uncomfortable making their story publicly accessible, now the whole recording is going to have to be archived as restricted. One of the things that I didn't say is on that interview, on that release form, at the bottom, it usually gives the interviewee the option to restrict the interview. So they might restrict it for 5 years. In the case of our the interviews that our students do for their courses and they turn it into their capstone, it might be restricted only to people who access it in the archive. So in other words, they have to come there, or it might be restricted to only people part of the church, or it might be restricted indefinitely, or it might be restricted until I'm dead, right? I mean, there's many ways that you can provide somebody, you can still collect the story and have it in the archive so that 50 years from now, it's an important record, but it might be that nobody listens to it for the next 5 years while that topic is still really hot or sore or sensitive or whatever. Yeah. So, you know, multiple ways to answer that question, I think, but part of it, yeah, I think if you are recording it, you need everybody's permission, and then you need that opportunity at the end to say, yes, I didn't say anything. That I'm not. I mean, the nice thing about a group interview is generally you already are a step closer to a public space, and so people are more likely to sign off on it because they've already said it in a group. Yeah. Good question.
Amy, I wonder. I'm thinking about the kind of cataloging piece of this. So now I'm going back to the idea of really of the one-on-one interview format, and I wonder if you have any tips. So the idea of having a transcription, that makes a ton of sense to me. And P.S. maybe folks already know this, but if you do your interview on Zoom, you can actually set up Zoom to create an automatic transcript of a video. So there are ways that maybe you can kind of get a heads up or at least an edge up on transcribing. Go ahead.
Say something about that though, because I have used some of the Zoom transcriptions of my interviews, and because every time I pause, it's a new line and it says Amy Skillman again. And if I want to turn that into a readable transcription, it almost took me longer than it did to just type it. So it's, yeah. But
that's really good.
databases that also do that you know, that do artificial, it's called AI, artificial, not intelligence, but it's, anyway, yeah, artificial interpretation or something like that. Yeah. But yeah, anyway, I'm sorry.
No. Thank you for sharing that. My larger question though is around, so I just wonder if you have any tips for how we might at least begin the cataloging process. I mean, do you do it by topic? Do you do it by demographic of those who you're interviewing? Do you do it by, you know, the time period that they're reflecting on? Like how, you know, because I imagine trying to go back and then, you know, be able to utilize some of this rich history. So I wonder if you have any, I might, if I were starting a project like this, I might imagine finding that part of it kind of daunting. Well, now how do I catalog this in a way that I'm going to be able to come back and, you know, so I wonder if you have any tips with 4 minutes to go on how we do that.
You know, one thing I would do is if you have a log or a transcription, you usually at the top of that, it has details like, you know, Amy Skillmer, or interviewee, interviewer, date, location, all of that. You might have one section that's keywords, and you might pull out some specific keywords like Alter Guild or folk music, you know, to use some of the examples I've used, racism. And that would be one, and then you could actually start creating a database that has that information, including a column for keywords. And then that becomes a way to code everything through those keywords. You have asked a question that is an archivist's ongoing nightmare, ongoing question. How do I catalog this? How do I organize this? When I do an interview, I give it a code, which has a year embedded in the code. Might say 2020 AS for my name, and then it have a number like 1, 2, 3, and all of my interviews will just be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then all of my forms, my biographical data form, my release form, my logs are all coded to that same number. And and so that's one way to actually keep all that in one place, and then get a grant to work with you know, get some students to come in and do coding so they can learn how to do coding and research. That would be really good.
I have another follow-up type question. Somebody had asked in the Q&A, if you were going to use the oral history in a parish history document, how would you cite it in the bibliography? How would you give it credit?
Question. This is something I teach my students all the time. So it depends on if your citation style is Chicago or MLA or APA. So that's the first thing to figure out in terms of your citations. But if you just have works cited or a citation, so the quote itself in the history would be put in quotes, and you would say Carolyn Patterson shares with us this story. And then in parentheses, it would just say interview, and it would have the date, and I think it has the name of the archive as well. I tell all my students to go, there's a quick guide. It's a really great website that's a quick guide for Chicago Manual of Style. You can actually go to that quick guide and scroll down to interview and see how they tell you to cite it. So that was your academic answer to that.
Amy, thank you so much. Believe it or not, friends, we have utilized our entire hour together. Amy, just so grateful for your wisdom and for your presence with us tonight. Friends, I'll remind you that we'll be together again next Wednesday. It'll be the same Zoom link, and we'll be looking into how you might go about writing a parish history. And we're going to look really even at the wider history of our beloved Diocese of Central Pennsylvania. For now, I'll say good night, and thank you again to Amy and to Carolyn.
My pleasure. It was fun.
Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you. Good night.
See ya.